If the Blair Witch, Boggy Creek Monster, or Legend of the Mothman aren't enough to keep you out of small towns, these creepy experiences from small towns sent in by subscribers just like you will definitely freak you out. I am always looking for any kind of scary story you might have to share, so if you have a story you'd like to hear on the channel, be sure to send it in to swampdweller.net or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to hear from you. Let's get into these tales of terror. Also joining me today is my good friend Fearcrawler, so if you enjoy his voice, please check out his channel that you can find in the description down below. He has great videos that I'm sure you'll love. I grew up in a small mining town in the Pilbara region of Western Australia. When I was a kid, the town was still quite small, holding only about 3,000 people in it. To give you an idea of the area, the town is basically dry, arid brushland with desert further out. It has a dam with some other water sources nearby, but also has massive expanses with nothing much in between them. One day, my schoolmates were bragging about riding their push bikes all the way to a roadhouse on the Great Northern Highway, which sits roughly halfway between our town and the next town over. The roadhouse is about a 2 to 2.5 hour drive with a speed limit mostly set at 110 miles an hour. However, there were tons of hills along the way, and the sun in the Pilbara is blaying hot. Because of this, riding your push bike there as a 13 or 14-year-old would be virtually impossible without some serious preparation. You would likely need rest stops planned out, water brought, and some sort of transportable shade at the very least to even stand a chance of making this trip. So, when they claimed they had made this trip with nothing more than school uniforms and water from a puddle on the way, I knew they had to be lying, and so I decided I would put their ringleader in his place. The guy was the only other guy in my school my size and was better at sports and never let me forget that. So you can imagine putting him in his place was something I wanted to do. Thinking he was full of it, I decided to challenge him in front of 20 or so kids who might as well have been his unofficial fan club at the time to do the ride again, but with me. I planned to take supplies in case he decided he wanted to give up, replicating his feat of living off the land like a true trailblazing pioneer. At this point, I thought he'd cop out and give me some sort of excuse for not doing it again. But, to my shock, he accepted the offer to do the ride with me. To my even greater surprise, he showed up in the beginning of the ride on Saturday morning with nothing more than his clothes and a water bottle, filled up only a quarter of the way. Trying to show up one another, we idiotically kicked things off at a fast pace. A half hour later we were starting to get tired, and I was beginning to lag behind. Further down, we eventually came to a winding area of the road, at which point I lost him around a bend. Feeling absolutely buggered, I decided to stop for a rest about 10 minutes before continuing on. I pushed with all I had and panic started setting in upon the realization that when I hit a long straightaway, there was still no sign of my friend. I became worried. He could have collapsed from dehydration or worse, a couple minutes up the road, and that thought kept me going very much. As time went on, I became too tired to ride my bike uphill and decided to walk it instead, but the road was so hot that my feet felt it through my shoes. I began to feel guilty the longer I went without finding the boy I began the ride with. What if something had happened? What if I had got him killed? After more searching, my mind had convinced me that I had gotten him killed. About a half hour later, I was coasting back when I saw a small goat track leading to a small crop of trees where I decided to take shelter from the heat. Most of the way down the track was when I saw a familiar bike. Hope rising within me, I began calling out for my rival. When I eventually found him, he was sitting up against a tree, throat too parched to make any real sound. I gave him a bottle of water, which he drank too fast and spent the next couple of minutes coughing and sputtering. We were both absolutely rooted at this point. After resting for a while, we walked our bikes back to the road where we were lucky enough to be rescued by a dude driving in a ute, a utility vehicle that is in the Australian equivalent of a pickup truck. Upon our arrival back, we went to my parents' house, where we played Sega for about 3 hours before my now friend finally headed back to his house. I collapsed at 4 in the morning and only woke at about 9 in the morning, Sunday, when my mom checked to see if I was okay, and that's what was wrong. I never told my parents what happened. I lied and said we'd been building jumps at the bike track, in the bush, all day all over the road. At lunch on Monday, my new friend left his mates and found me, asking me if I wanted to play Foursquare with them. His friend thought he was going to make a fool of me about the entire ride, but I just nodded and accepted his invite. That was that. We never became close friends, but after that, he respected me and stopped encouraging the other guys to give me a hard time. We both eventually became part of this silly initiative the school was pushing called the School Council. He became the rec guy and I the environmental guy. We never truly forgot that day of riding, though.
One night when I was around 8 or so, I'd gone to bed early. I had school in the morning, you know. I slept pretty well that night, all things considered, but woke up out of a sound sleep at some point in the wee hours of the morning. I did not have an alarm clock at this point in time, so there's no telling what time it was. All I knew was that the sky was black outside my window. In any case, I woke up to the feeling of being watched. I thought it might be one of my little brothers standing by my bed, as they tend to come to me instead of my parents for comfort when they had nightmares in the middle of the night. I didn't feel any kind of threat or scared in any kind of way, but I slowly cracked my eyes to see who was there. There was nothing. I opened my eyes all the way, and only then did I notice what looked like the outline of a thin older male with glasses and a long-sleeved shirt on. The odd part was that this image was completely see-through, except for the outline of his body, glasses, and clothes, which glowed in several shades of blues and greens that shimmered and shifted like the northern lights. Even though I had no knowledge of the northern lights at this stage of my life, that's the best way I can describe it. He just stood there with a soft smile on his face, about a foot away from the side of my bed, watching me. My father had been known to come in and check on us kids in the night sometimes, so I sleepily asked, "Papa?" thinking this was the case. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and Mom was waking me up to get us all ready for the bus. I asked my dad if he'd checked on us during the night, but he denied it. He listened to my story but said nothing in reply, probably chalking it up to dreams or my imagination. But I know what I saw. Years later, I brought it up again at my dad's house, and he seemed to think that it may have been the spirit of my great-great-grandfather, who'd passed away the month before I had been born. Our great-great-grandma was still around, so when I had the chance, I asked her about her husband. She described a thin, spectacled man who was sweet as could be, always with a smile on his face. She proceeded to tell me that he'd passed away from lung cancer, but had he had the chance to meet us, he would have spoiled my brothers and I rotten. Knowing this, I'm certain that's who came to visit me that night.
My mother married a highly successful businessman in 1988. This man was from a prominent local family who owned a funeral parlor. The businessman owned a painting franchise retail store and an interior design company. He also was a master carpenter who eventually opened his own Civil War reproduction artillery shop, where he would build antique cannons for the National Park Service, as well as for individual investors. Needless to say, The man was entranced with history, and he would often visit colonial Williamsburg, which led him to build several homes in our Kentucky city that were patterned after historical buildings and plantation homes, inspired by his visits to the Virginia colony. This leads me to my story. It was October of 1992 when my parents, having recently finished building an impressive 3-story plantation home on the outskirts of town, decided to buy a piece of property downtown in an antiquated suburb. Surrounded by mansions and structures that have been a part of the city for well over 100 years, this area of town came complete with an old stone church and was within walking distance of our famous Central Park. The property my parents bought was small, but the house was massive, sitting at almost 6,000 square feet, with 3 levels and a basement on it, which were curiously divided into 4 apartments. The current owner, a local minister, had segmented the house in such a manner that he lived alone on the first floor. The second floor housed 3 individual apartments, with a back staircase for access that was completely separated for his living space on the first floor. The third floor was completely empty, having previously been a ballroom of the original occupants before being destroyed by a fire in 1922, and never being reclaimed afterward. At this point in time, I was a 16-year-old, an honor student, and I was completely clean and sober. I even used to lecture people about the dangers of drinking and smoking, which was ironic as I'm 42 now and am no stranger to drugs and alcohol. At the time, however, I was a party virgin, so I wasn't under the influence of anything but self-preservation. Now, my story can truly begin. As a 16-year-old male, I had constant heat with my stepfather. We gritted against one another from time to time. When I found out about the recent property purchase, I knew they weren't going to move in until they had it good enough condition to move the entire family in. 5 of us, including 2 dogs and a cat. Knowing this, and wanting some peace and quiet, I asked my family if I could move into one of the apartments to get some peace and quiet from the family. Much to my surprise, they agreed. So a couple buddies and I moved all my shit out of the house and into the new apartment as quickly as possible before my family could change their minds. I'd never taken the time to check the apartment out, so when we arrived with the key and our stuff, I was completely overwhelmed. The house was massive. It was totally gothic. Stone pillars, black iron fence, stained glass windows, 2 staircases, 4 outside entrance points, and a painted blood red. I was quite surprised my stepfather had bought the place, as it wasn't the least bit colonial, and it didn't resemble the southern plantation homes I was used to. I was and still am big into horror movies, so being able to live in a house like this, by myself for at least a few months, was the coolest thing ever. My enthusiasm was hindered only by one thing. The only working phone line was in the basement. Soon after moving all my stuff into my second floor dwelling and my buddies departing, I tried to settle into my new surroundings. Old hardwood floors, chipped paint, faulty lighting, and the coming of sundown brought me new fear. The realization had hit me that I was going to be alone in this colossal rundown mansion with bad pipes, bad lights, and since cell phones were not a thing yet, no way of communicating with anyone. Trying not to think too much on this, I took the skeleton key and locked all of the doors before reading the subway for a BLT. Upon returning and letting myself in, all the doors were standing ajar by an inch. Nervous, I made my way to the apartment with what little light was available as the light in the hallway was now off. Locking myself in my new abode, I began eating my sandwich. Eventually, I headed back out with a flashlight and my skeleton key and relocked all the doors once again. I always felt really isolated in the house, and yet I could never shake this feeling of being watched. I soon headed back to my apartment, hooking up my stereo and a DVD player before watching a movie. About a half hour into the film, I heard someone coming up the stairs, so I paused the movie. Nothing. I waited, listened intently for another few minutes, but still there was nothing. Feeling a little paranoid, I took my flashlight and key and made my way to the upper corridor. Once again, I found every door unlocked and opened an inch. Feeling that I needed to back up, I locked my apartment and left. I headed to my best friend's workplace, Blockbuster, before telling him what was going on. He informed me his shift ended at 11 and he'd come over to my place then. After his shift, he headed back to my apartment and locked ourselves inside. At about 12:30 a.m., I heard the sound of someone coming up the stairs again. This was soon followed by an unbearable silence. Dusty got up and armed himself with an American cavalry sword. I realized how stupid this sounds, before we both made our way into the upper hall. Once again, every door was ajar by an inch. We decided to make a clean sweep of the entire house except for the basement, locking every door behind us as we did. At about 1 a.m., we finished our sweep and returned to my room again. For the remainder of the night, we'd hear footsteps and neither of us could sleep. Checking things again in the morning, we saw all the doors unlocked and open by an inch. Now comes the scary part. Later that day after school, I went back to eat dinner with my family at their house. During our meal, my mother asked how my night went. Trying not to sound much like a coward, I told my family I loved the place, especially the peace and quiet from my other siblings, and my overbearing stepfather. My mom soon gave me a puzzled look. "You didn't sound too good over the phone," she said. "What are you talking about?" I asked. She then said, "I called you last night and you sounded odd." I asked her what she meant, and informed her I never went into the basement, nor did I hear the phone ringing at all last night. My mother then informed me not to scare my little brothers like that. To this day, she still swears she spoke to me on the phone that night. I never answered the phone. Dusty never answered the phone. Neither of us heard the phone at all that night. I'm not sure what happened, but one thing is clear. Something answered the phone that night and it wasn't us. This happened a few years ago when I was new to the Army. I had finished basic training and was done with my job training as well, when I got 2 separate orders from the Army that were soon after cancelled, leaving me stuck waiting for orders again. One day, while hoping orders would come in, the training platoon sergeant came in and called mine and another guy's name. Sergeant asked if we had our berets, ID cards, and wallets. We said yes, at which point we were told to report to the staff duty van. Once we arrived, another sergeant told us we were going to be battle buddies for a soldier they were picking up from a hospital. We got in and started driving. Initially, we thought we were going to the base hospital until we turned and headed for the front gate. Okay, I thought. We were likely going to the hospital in town instead. Then, at the front gate, we turned, heading out of town instead of into town. Finally, the sergeant pulled into a gas station to turn back to us. The sergeant then informed us we were going to pick up a soldier in Phoenix. The sergeant then told us, if you need a snack, a drink, or to use the latrine, do so now, or forever hold your peace. 10 minutes later, we were back on the road again. When we finally arrived in Phoenix, we went looking for the particular clinic at the hospital. We went around the campus twice before finally finding the entrance. We were sent back to the van shortly after the guard inspected us for guns and objects sharp and blunt that could potentially be used as weapons. Shortly after this, we finally made it into the waiting area. There was a double door behind us with a former linebacker in hospital scrubs, and to the right of us was a waiting area with tables and vending machines. To the left was a door too small, but there was an office behind it with plexiglass, and straight ahead was a double door with electronic locks and signs that read no visitors beyond this point. The sergeant went to talk to people in the plexiglass office while we took seats at a table. After 5 minutes of arguing with the staff, they took the sergeant back to beyond the security doors. My buddy and I waited around for about 15 more minutes before hearing a commotion near the front entrance. Some cops were hauling in a thrashing man. One of the cops spotted us and asked us for help to hold the man down. We looked at one another before deciding to tackle the guy. I swear my buddy shouted, "Leroy Jenkins!" before we tackled the man, holding him down. The man we tackled was thrashing and moaning about being so hungry and needing to eat. After what was likely a minute, but that felt more like hours, the staff came out and stuck the man with the needle that put him to sleep. Once he'd settled down, the staff strapped the man to a gurney. One of the cops went and talked to a lady on the staff while the other guys came over and spoke with us. The man on the gurney turned out to be a homeless man who'd been stalking around the neighborhood and attacking residents. They tased the man before arresting him, and it was clear he needed to be examined. We brought up the eat marks before one of the staff said 2 words that sent chills through the room. Wendigo psychosis. The cop then said, "What?" The staff member then informed the cop that people go crazy and want to eat people. She then said, think of it as like those Ted Bundy serial killer types. Soon after that, everything settled down, and 15 minutes later, the sergeant returned with the private to the security area. My buddy and I wondered if we'd have to wrestle this guy down too. All the private said was hi. Soon after that, we headed back to the base, and everything was quiet again. I'll start by telling you a few things about me. I'm 18 years old and live in northern Canada, in 2 different homes. One is with my father, who lives right in the middle of 222 acres of woods. We've got but a single neighbor, who is situated about 1 kilometer away. My second home is with my mother. She lives on the edge of a city, close to the woods and the main shopping center. The story is split into 3 parts, and believe me, it may sound crazy, but I swear, all of this is true. The first part of the story starts at my father's house. I'd often go for walks in the woods. It was peaceful and quiet. I'd always bring my 3 dogs for protection, a German Shepherd and 2 Australian Shepherds. Nothing ever happened in the woods. There was the occasional sighting of bears, and we found quite a few lynx tracks, but nothing out of the ordinary. Until something started watching me from the woods. A black figure of sorts. At first, I thought it was just my paranoid mind playing tricks on me, so I shrugged it off. A few days passed since I first felt the strange watching presence. It was a cold day out. The sun was gone and the wind came from the north, making it even colder. It was around noon, and it was time for me to bring the dogs out for a walk. I brought them down to the road that leads to my house. Nobody was around and it was silent all over, except for the wind blowing through the tree leaves. I was calm, but then it felt like I was being followed. Of course my dogs were following me, but this feeling was dark. I continued and eventually turned back to go home. Everyone was gone, so I arrived to an empty house. As I was about to bring the dogs into their kennel, I noticed one of the Aussies was frozen in place. He was staring into the woods. I tried to get his attention, but he would not budge. I walked over to him, pat his head. He only growled, but not to me. He growled to whatever was in the woods. The dog was pacing, tail tucked between his legs and ears held back. That made me feel a little uneasy, since I had been feeling watched or followed during the walk. It also meant I wasn't the only one who felt it. I decided to be safe and locked the door when I was inside. I'd like to say this feeling left after a while, but no, it only became more frequent. I had to lock and cover my windows at night because it felt as though someone was peering through them. I told people about it, especially those I lived with. They'd tell me it was a bear or maybe some ghost. A few even mentioned that it could be a stalker. I knew it was neither of these things. It just didn't feel right. Fast forward to about 3 months after the first occurrence. It's September, and the weather has begun to get colder. I was outside with my dogs cleaning some skulls I had recently gotten from a trapper. I was just minding my own business. All of my family members were gone, so I was left alone again. Then, I went near the forest and felt the dark presence again. It was so strange. I just couldn't shake it off as nothing. Scared, I went inside and decided to make myself some food in the comfort of my home. The fear left, and I felt safe again, until I heard the dreadful sound coming from the woods outside. It sounded like a man screaming, a deer howling in pain, and the low growl of a bear, all at once. It was the scariest thing I've ever heard in my life. I checked all the doors and ran to the second story of the house to hide. I'm not sure why I felt so much fear, since I heard nothing after that, but I called a relative, and they told me I was just hearing things. That night, I could barely sleep. I was afraid of whatever this thing was going to come inside. I kept seeing things in the shadows of the trees after this incident. It was hard to ignore. Eventually, I went to live with my mother in the city. I was there for a better chance at a job. I also had some friends to reunite with there. Once I moved, I met up with my childhood best friend. She and I decided to take a long walk in the chilly temperatures of the night. We talked and talked. Nothing happened until about 11:30. We were crossing the street when I heard the same exact sound, but much louder, coming from the woods down the road. I was terrified. My friend, though, paid no attention to it. We continued walking, but I was a little more paranoid than before, just waiting for something to jump out after me. An hour passed and we had to split ways. She went home and I did too. I had some instrumental music playing on my phone to keep me calm. Obviously, that didn't last long. Of course, something had to happen in the dead of night while I was alone. As I walked in the streets, I heard a baby scream, but it didn't sound normal. It was a horrifying, distorted scream. I looked in the direction of the sound and thought I saw someone there. My feet moved faster than before, trying to get me home. Then I heard another scream, much scarier than the first. I ran for it. That might not have been the best decision, but it was instinctive. Suddenly, I heard feet hitting the pavement and felt like something or someone was chasing me. I looked back quickly and thought I saw a large black figure coming, but it only lasted several seconds till I saw nothing. The shouts and screams did not stop though. I finally got home, but I realized the door was locked and couldn't get inside. Unfortunately, those screams continued. After many calls and pressing the doorbell, my stepfather opened the door. I was a hyperventilating mess, but I got through it. I'm very spiritual, and I've been told by many mediums or spiritual leaders that I am a beacon for bad spirits. I assumed that it was a bad spirit, but I remember reading about wendigos, a creature that is apparently connected to me in some ways that are unknown to me. I did research again and deeply believe that whatever followed me is still watching me. I'm not sure if it's a wendigo, but it could be. Some acquaintances agree that it is quite possible. Now I'm just waiting for my next encounter with it, and I'm left wondering, what does it want, and what will it do next? Let me start off by saying that I am a larger 15-year-old male with two brothers who we'll call Will and Scott. Will is my twin brother, while Scott is our older 17-year-old brother. We live in a very safe, small mountain town by the name of Boone, here in North Carolina, where we attend a local high school. Before I get too deep into the story, I'd like to give a little background information. I've lived in Boone my entire life. Having moved here once my brother Will and I were born, there are many other kids our age here, and at the end of the street live Mr. and Mrs. Phillips. Mrs. Phillips always loved joking around and playing with the children of the neighborhood. I believe she did this as their own children died in a drunk driving accident. Sadly, last year, Mrs. Phillips died, and it shook our community as she was a very well-respected member of our neighborhood, who everyone loved and very dearly enjoyed. Mr. Phillips, on the other hand, was a lot rowdier, and always seemed to have something to complain about. That being said, he was always nice to me, and he'd always say I reminded him of his dead son Andrew. This always made me feel somewhat sad, and after Mrs. Phillips' death, Mr. Phillips went somewhat crazy. One December morning, I decided I would brave the cold and skip on riding with my brothers so I could sit next to a girl I liked on the bus. I began my 5 to 10 minute walk to the bus stop when I noticed Mr. Phillips' truck idling in his driveway. Most of the vehicles in the neighborhood were doing the same, so I thought nothing of it and continued my trek at the bottom of the street. On the way down, I noticed a dog in the window, and being the immature teen I was at the time, I decided to shout loudly, which of course got the dog all riled up and barking. Suddenly, I heard a very loud engine roar to life. Looking back, I noticed Mr. Phillips' truck going about 35 miles above the speed limit, heading straight for me with no signs of going around me. When his truck got about 10 feet away from me, I dove for the ditch, at which point I looked back to see if Mr. Phillips was going to slow down or check if I was okay. He didn't. Instead, he was cackling like a madman and yelling out of his truck window that I need to pay attention to where I'm walking next time, or he will hit me. I was shocked at Mr. Phillips' actions, but I decided not to tell my parents about what had happened, both to avoid trouble and because I knew my dad would probably kick his ass and didn't want him to get hurt or any sort of legal trouble. As time went on, we saw less and less of Mr. Phillips, who mostly stayed in his home and drank whiskey. If Mr. Phillips needed something, his nephew Jake would get it for him. In some ways, I felt happy as I knew if he was inside, Mr. Phillips wouldn't be a dick to everyone in town. Yet, some part of me also felt sadness, like this guy I'd grown up knowing used to do things like give us $5 bills just because he felt like it, and would sometimes hold dodgeball games with the kids in the neighborhood. Now he'd become a husk of his former self, only bitter and angry. I say all of this because he soon began complaining about my older Walker coonhound named Jack, that I had had since I was 4. Jack would go out to pee in the mornings, and sometimes he'd wander in Mr. Phillips' yard, scratching around, looking for scraps around his barbecue pit. Almost every other day, Mr. Phillips would now come pounding on my door, telling me to get my dog out of his yard. Because of this, I began letting Jack out less and less until one summer morning, feeling tired, I let him out to do his business anyways, before going back to bed, wanting to hear him bark to come back in. After 2 hours of not hearing Jack, my brother and I went outside and looked for him. We thought that maybe he was snagged a deer or something, but at his age, it was getting quite hard to do. Our worry began to grow when we called his name all up and down the street but never got a response. Out of options, we eventually went home and called my close friend Ryan. Soon after, we used Ryan's truck to slowly go up and down the street looking for our dog Jack. When we approached Mr. Phillips' house, I was just going to ignore him, but he waved at us before smiling. If you want something done correctly, do it yourself. Confused, I asked him if he had seen our dog Jack, to which he responded in an almost laughing voice. I think I saw him in your backyard. Relieved we finally knew where he was, my brother headed back to our home before approaching the backyard. To our shock and horror, we found our 11-year-old best friend Jack hanging from a tree and clearly dead. I fell to my knees in tears, not wanting to believe what I was seeing. My sweet dog had been murdered. I felt my older brother grab my arm and tell me we need to go inside to call 911. Dragging me inside, we did just that, and when the police arrived, they cut down Jack and offered to take him in. But I told them no, and let them know we could bury him. When we finally were questioned, I told them about Mr. Phillips, and I was sure he had killed my dog. They soon headed over to that bastard's house where he was still smiling, before talking to him for about 15 minutes and returning, telling us they didn't have sufficient evidence that he was the one who killed our dog, so they couldn't arrest him. By this time, my mother was home early from the situation and raising hell that they needed to arrest him. Sadly, they never did. The old son of a bitch got away with murdering my dog and almost running me over. though I never told anyone about that. I eventually decided if the law wasn't going to give me justice, then I would do it myself. One day, I took my lacrosse stick and a bucket of balls out of 50 yards up the hill where Mr. Phillips lived. I soon began launching the balls at his home, breaking 2 windows before he finally came out to confront me. Mr. Williams told me to stop, at which point I threw him in the middle finger and tried launching a ball at his chest. It hit him in the thigh, and he fell over before I decided to run. Locking my doors at home, I realized after the fact what I did was probably a bad idea. A week later, Mr. Phillips' windows were fixed. One day, I was just about to doze off when I woke to the sound of my window shutting. I was terrified and didn't look, but I knew it was likely Mr. Phillips. I felt my bed sink and a knife was pressed against my cap before I heard Mr. Phillips whispering, "It would be a shame if a big, strong lacrosse player like you had his calf cut wide open, wouldn't it?" I screamed for my dad, and Mr. Phillips escaped out the window, leaving it open. My parents believed my story and called the cops, who came over, but after questioning Mr. Phillips, they claimed they had no evidence that it happened, so they still couldn't do anything. Mr. Phillips was once again let go, with no charges against him. My parents eventually installed cameras and filed a restraining order against him, but every couple of days I'd hear him outside singing his old war songs, and on one occasion, Beastie Boys, which scared me even more. Finally, he came to the backyard one night with a bottle of booze and began singing something that sounded like this. "My time is up and you have won. My wife is dead and nobody cares. Go to hell, go to hell. Gonna end it all, gonna end it all." My dad and I watched him and even began to chuckle at one point, because he was so crazy. Mr. Phillips wasn't a liar, however, because the next day on his wife's birthday, he shot himself on her gravesite. Well, tarnation, brother. Those small town stories surely creeped me out. Especially that last one. Holy crap, keep Mr. Phillips away from me, huh? If you like these stories, be sure to hit that like button, as it helps me out a ton. If you're new to the swamp, why not subscribe and turn on notifications, as I upload videos almost every single day on all things natural and supernatural. If you have a story you'd like to share in a future video, send it in to swampdweller.net, or the email you can find in the description down below. I'd love to share your story with everyone here in the swamp. I have some cool merch designs you can check out, the link is also in the description below. We'd love to see you wearing a Swamp Dweller shirt, and I'll see you guys soon with another creepy video.